Hey everybody, how you doing? This is my analysis of Everyday Use by Alice Walker. One of my favorite stories because it's such an interesting one that asks really important questions. So here goes. At the beginning of Everyday Use, the opening paragraph introduces us to the first metaphor. A house that is dirt poor, literally, it's dirt on the floor, but full of culture if you look for it. But from a quick glance, it just looks like a shanty. So we get introduced to Maggie, who's the youngest daughter, who is tie-shimmied and literally scarred emotionally and physically. And then we get this like little weird paragraph where Mama starts thinking about the other daughter, the one who went to college, who got educated, and how she's coming back, and how on TV, where everything's perfect, you would have like this picturesque, full of appreciation and reconciliation, long absence, healed physically with hugs and gifts and flowers. But then we get the rest of the story, the real reunion, right? And in the real reunion, what ends up happening is an argument. And this argument is about this question, which is how do you preserve a culture? How do you preserve our traditions? And it's a really, really complicated question that Alice Walker really asks. And I think to the African American community, it's a really important question too at the time it was written, because they were wrestling with their history, their most recent history of slavery, and the history that had kind of been robbed from them. And how does a culture kind of like create itself out of that way? So, and other cultures have wrestled with this too. You don't have to look even farther back than, more recently. You can look at all the genocides that have happened to other cultures in the rainforest who have been kind of extinguished. And how do we preserve those? Are they worth preserving? And that's a question that some people answer no to. But in the story, Walker kind of wrestles with these things. She says, Mama tells us how unlike TV this reunion is. How she's not like a TV person, that she has had to work hard her whole life. That she can break hard ice with her hands. These are things that a woman shouldn't be able to do, right? But she's tough. She doesn't have a husband for whatever reason, right? So she's had to do all the work, and she's a tough lady. She can break hard ice. She can eat boiling pig liver straight out of the thing. She can field dress a cow, which takes a lot of strength and takes a lot of know-how because she kills a cow and she's got to have it hanging, the meat ready to go. Anything that a man can do, she can do. She's had a hard life, but it's produced valuable skills, right? And that her suffering has made her strong in this way. And this is kind of a little bit of a metaphor for the culture, the African American culture, and how out of the pain and struggle of slavery, it produced some valuable things that they carried with them. Um, not that it was worth it or anything, not justifying slavery, but just that's kind of like the metaphor there. She points to the racism she's had to endure too. Mama is a living part of African American history. She grew up in Jim Crow, Georgia. She experienced racism like crazy. She's the granddaughter to slaves. So it's very recent in her history. She gets ready for Dee, whose name has now been changed to Wangaro, and she compares her older sister, who has this education, to Maggie, who she describes as a wounded animal, timid and shy. You can see that Maggie kind of grows up in the same environment that her mother did. But she's not as strong as her mother yet. But over time, she will grow that way. She'll learn. Dee, on the other hand, has separated herself from her mother. She's gone off to college. She also is lighter skinned, which gives her, in a racist world, a little less racism, I imagine. So she's lucky in that way, that she may not be treated as poorly as some darker skinned women, which means she might have experienced less racism. And I just want to stop here and say, I don't know anything about that. But from Critical Essays, this is how I'm reading this. But also, we're also being told this story through Mama's perspective, and that's really important to remember, because just like A&P was told through the narrative of Sammy, and we experience everything through his mind, we're experiencing everything from Mama's mind. So Mama's definitely opinionated, and she definitely has feelings about what Dee has done, Wangaro, right? So then we get a story. We get a story that there's this implication that long ago, 12 or 13 years ago, before Dee went off to college, when she was like 16, she started a fire to burn down the house, that she'd always been ashamed of their house, and that she left the burning house. She has this image, Mama has this image of Wangaro under the tree, picking gum out of, it's a gum tree, so just like kind of just keeping herself busy, almost bored, while the house burns down. And we find out that this is where little Maggie got her arms all burned, that her skin had melted to the point that it was sticking to Mama's shirt as she carried her out. And you can see that there's some resentment here on on Mama's part. That she left the burning house without any of the valuable quilts or these churners that she's returned to ask for. That she also left the house with her mother and her sister there. But she was a child, so we can't really, it's not like she was like this murderer who's like planned to do arson and burn the house with the family down. But the fact is, she didn't run in there to save them, right? And now she's running back to the house to save some things. So, like, the question is why? And the answer is because she's learned about her culture and she's learned about how valuable it is. Dee has had an education. Remember, she had funds raised by the church in Georgia to send her off to Augusta, where she wanted a better life. And how could you blame her? She lives in a dirt poor house with not a lot of options, right? Look at Maggie. Maggie is going to live in that house the rest of her life. She's going to get married to the guy down the street. Her life has been written. Dee wants more, and Dee was smart. Dee could read. Dee had more opportunities than maybe Maggie gives herself the opportunities to have. But Mama kind of sees this as a rejection. Whether that's true or not is up to you, but this is Mama's perspective. But I don't blame Dee for wanting to improve her life, or at least make it easier. But with that, Alice Walker is arguing you have to make some other kinds of sacrifices. So, they're dirt poor. Maggie has her mother's strength. She says this one line in here that I think is a really interesting thing. She says she got hooked by a cow back in the, when she was milking it. And she says, don't try to milk a cow the wrong way. And I think that's her point in this entire short story, is that Dee Wangaro is milking the cow the wrong way. She's trying to take the artifacts without the culture attached. And I'll get to that at the end. So, Dee writes from college. Mama remembers that she won't bring friends home, that she's ashamed of her poverty. And when Dee Wangaro shows up with her boyfriend, Hakeem, it's apparent that she's become a member of the Black nationalist movement. And what does that mean? Well, the Black nationalist movement was a type of political thought that seeks to promote, develop, and maintain a Black race identity for people of Black ancestry. Black nationalist activism revolves around social, political, and economic empowerment of Black communities and people, especially to resist assimilation into white culture, and maintain a distinct Black identity. It's an effort to reject the cultures imposed upon them and to reclaim their African identity, what was stolen from them when they were brought over against their wills as slaves. So you can see, you'll probably aware, if you don't know this movement by name, of people who were in it. So one of the things that Black nationalists did was they rejected their slave names. The last name of Dee and Mama and Maggie is Johnson, but that's not their African names where their culture eventually came from. Like, my last name is De Armas, right? It's Cuban. I don't know the great-great-great-great-grandparents I had, but I'm assuming someone had that last name and it came to me this way. But the Johnsons can't trace their last name much farther than slavery, because it was the name of the slave master, right? So you have someone like Muhammad Ali, whose real slave name was Cassius Clay, and he changed his name because he realized that's not who my family was. I need to identify this by, even though I can't find the actual name, I'm going to change my name to a name that means something that I choose. So his name is changed to Muhammad Ali. Malcolm X is another example of this, right? And Dee Wangaro, she changes her name from Dee to Wangaro as this kind of Black nationalist, like, I'm going to reclaim my identity. Another thing that they did was they changed their religion. As slaves, a lot of slaves were given Christianity, or given is a nice word for it, but maybe they were forced to become Christians when they came over here. The Black nationalist movement, lots of the time they were either Muslim or they were members of the Nation of Islam. And then another thing that they did was they reclaimed their Black dress. So they wore dashikis, these bright colors. So when Dee comes out of the car, we see all of this. She speaks in a Muslim salutation. She reclaims her African heritage, which reaches past her Christian slave name, her all these things that were imposed on her culture. She takes a Polaroid picture before she hugs her mother. And I think Alice Walker includes this because Mama takes offense at that. Because for the woman who left for college, who didn't want anything to do with her poor upbringing, she really wants to take pictures to remember it by. She seems to Mama to be less of, it seems that Mama is less of her mother and more of an image to be captured. But once the picture's taken, she puts it back in the car, having safely gotten that, and that's the first thing she takes. And then she gives her mother a kiss. And she tells her mother, my name's changed to Wangerro. And we get this kind of awkward interchange. And just let me read it to you. She says, well, Dee, and Wangerro respectfully corrects her. She says, no, Mama, not Dee. Wangerro Liwanika Kamanjo. And Mama says, what happened to Dee? And Wangerro said, she's dead. I couldn't bear it any longer, being named after the people who oppressed me, right? Talking about the slave name. But Mama doesn't see it that way. Her memory doesn't attach their name to slavery. She sees Johnson as her immediate family, just like the quilts, right? She doesn't see the quilts as these relics of African-American culture. She sees them as her grandmother's quilts, right? She says, you know as well as me, you was named after your Aunt Dicey. Dicey's my sister. She named Dee. We called her Big D after Dee was born. But who was she named after? Asked Wangerro. And you can see Wangerro's trying to get her mother to reach beyond family to culture. Her mother, I said. She says, I guess after Grandma Dee. And then Wangerro says, and who is she named after? And she goes, her mother. That's about as far back as I can trace it. Though, in fact, I probably could have carried it back beyond the Civil War through the branches. Well, there you go. And Mama says, there I was not. Dicey cropped up in our family, so why should I trace it that far back? And this is this question about cultural use and cultural history, because a name is something you also use. So maybe someone named this slave Johnson, but once they took that, just like they took Christianity, could it become a part of their traditions and rituals and histories now? Or must it always be this thing that was imposed? And Mama and Maggie stand on one side of that argument. They say that's a part of us. And Wangerro has rejected that. Dee knows the family history. So she says this. She goes, oh, Mama, I never, Dee knows the family history culturally. Maggie knows her family, right? Wangerro says, oh, Mama, I never knew how lovely these benches are. You can feel the rump prints, meaning the people who are in it, right? Who sat in it for years and years, generations. I knew there was something I wanted to ask you if I could have, and she jumps up and she goes over the corner where the churn stood. This is the place where they made butter out of milk, right? Like this is a it's called a crabber, right? She looked at the churn and looked at it. The churn top is what I need. Didn't Uncle Buddy whittle it out of a tree you used to have? Yes, I said. And she goes, I want the dasher too. Uncle Buddy whittled that too? And Auntie's first husband whittled the dash, says Maggie. So Maggie corrects her because she knows the history of these things. His name was Henry, but they called him Stash. Wangerro gets the dasher and the shoot top, and she says she plans on using them as decorative pieces in their house. She's going to put them on as a centerpiece. She's going to hang them on the wall like the quilts, which divorces them from their use. If they stay with Mama and Maggie, they'll continue to make butter, and maybe they break, but they continue to be used in the tradition, the practice. I taught my daughter. She taught her daughter. She taught her daughter how to make butter in this same thing, and that gives it value to us Johnsons. But what Wangerro sees is that this is from this place that we've risen out of, that we came from poverty, and look, this needs to be preserved because it's an important artifact of what happened to us after slavery. So then they move on to the quilts, and they had been pieced by Grandma Dee and Big D, and we find out that there was a certain start of pattern, and quilts were really important to post-slavery times because they were, number one, ways that they would hang them outside for the Underground Railroad. And the patterns on the quilts would sometimes communicate safety or danger for people who were trying to run away. But also, they carried family history. And quilt making was really important because it was one of the only times that slaves were given autonomy. Power to do something without being told. So we find out that they had certain like fabrics that were more than 50 years ago, old dresses. One teeny faded blue piece the size of a penny matchbox that was a uniform from the Civil War. And she says, can I have these old quilts? And Mama says, why don't you take the other two? These old quilts was just done by me and Big D from some tops your grandma pieced before she died. No, said Wangerro, I want those. They're stitched around the borders by a machine. They'll make them last better, Mama says. She goes, that's not the point, says Wangerro. Wangerro doesn't want them as quilts. She wants them as cultural artifacts. She doesn't want to wrap her body in them. She wants to put them on the wall so that they won't be used anymore. And this is the point. If something is that valuable, it has a Civil War uniform, gosh, it'd be awful if we lost it. But at the same time, if my grandmother makes me a quilt, gosh, it'd be awful if I didn't warm myself with it. So these are all pieces, dresses Grandma used to wear. She did all this stitching by hand. Imagine she held the quilt securely in her arms, stroking them. Some of these pieces, like those lavender ones, come from old clothes her mother handed down to her, I said. And then Wangeroo moved back just enough so she couldn't have the quilts. They already belonged to her. She says, imagine making them. But Maggie and Mama do make them. They don't have to imagine. They're part of the cultural practice. I promised to give these quilts to Maggie for when she marries John Thomas. And Wangeroo gasps like a bee stung her. Oh, Maggie can't appreciate these quilts. She'd probably be backward enough to put them to everyday use. And that's where we get the title. That is it backward to take something of significant cultural importance and use it? Well, if Wangeroo gets the quilts and she doesn't know how to quilt anymore, those quilts stay the same length. But they'll be preserved in their current state. If Maggie gets the quilts, who knows how to quilt, they may be lost. The oldest pieces may fray and fall off when she sleeps with them. But they'll be added to. She'll continue to quilt, and in that way the tradition lives on. Maybe the product might change and be lost, but more quilts will be made by Johnson family members. If Wangeroo gets them, quilts won't be made anymore. And that's the question I think Walker's asking us here. Is culture just the item, or is it also the practice? She'd probably be backward enough to put them to everyday use. I reckon she would, I said. God knows I've been saving them long enough with nobody using them. I hope she will. I didn't want to bring up how I'd offered Dee a quilt when she went away to college. He told me they were old-fashioned back then. So Mama resents her for not embracing their culture. So the question, again, what is the valuable part of a culture? Is it the things they produce? Or are they just as valuable as the producers, the way they're produced, the rituals, traditions, the sitting on the porch, the sewing in the rocking chair together, the passing of dip back and forth? And I think this is dramatized too by the characters. Wangeroo is light-skinned. Wangeroo wears a lot of clothing over her black skin. And she wears big glasses, and she covers her body up just for style. But Maggie lets her body be seen, scars and all. If Maggie's body is used, just like Mama's, she's been hooked in the side, well, that's better, because at least she's using it and she's showing it. She's been burned, and that's a part of her too, like a quilt that's been damaged. Maggie says, Wangeroo says, but they're priceless. Maggie would put them in the bed, and in 5 years they'd be in rags. And Wangeroo's right. She can always make some more, I said. So Mama's talking about the tradition, the making. Maggie knows how to quilt. Wangeroo looked at me with hatred. You just will not understand. The point is these quilts, these ones, the ones with the Civil War uniform in it. What would you do with them? Mama asks her, and she says, hang them. As if, and I just want to stop for a second there. Hanging them is a really heavy word. If you think about African American culture and lynching, hanging them is a bad thing. But also hanging them also hangs the practice. They don't quilt anymore. She says, as if it was the only thing she could do with quilts. Maggie by now was standing in the door. I could almost hear the sound her feet made as they scraped over each other. She can have them. So Maggie's like, she can have them. I can always make more. I remember Grandma Dee without these quilts. So again, Maggie persists in saying these are not cultural items to me. These are reminders of my grandmother. And Walker, through Mama, decides that's who deserves it. Because you can't have a culture without people. Mama makes her decision and snatches them back and gives them to Maggie. They'll most likely be used and lost to time, but they'll also be added to. And Wangeroo says, you just don't understand. And Mama says, what don't I understand? Your heritage. And there you go. That's the question. Who doesn't understand the heritage? Certainly, there is a cultural importance to these things, and they definitely belong in a museum. However, they also belong to the people who use them. She kisses her sister and she says, "You ought to try to make something of yourself too, Maggie. It's really a new day for us. But from the way you and Mama still live, you'd never know it." But they continue to live in that culture that she's so proud to be connected to and wants artifacts from. Their names are a kind of quilt. Do you get rid of them or do you use them? The house is a kind of quilt. Do you try to get away from the house and take a picture of it? Or do you still live in it? Maggie's arms are a kind of quilt. Do you try to cover it with clothing? Or do you show, listen, I've been in a fire and I use my arms still? All of these things might have value because of their use. Mama dismisses these people because we're listening to her narrative. So she says these kind of, like, she calls him Hakim a barber, calls him assalamu alaikum, which is kind of insulting. And I don't think Mama's like the perfect character that some people think she is. She's the narrator. But Wangeroo makes good points too. Consider the Declaration of Independence. If we were to take it out of the vacuum-sealed container that it's in, it would turn into dust. That would be no good. We shouldn't use it anymore. Consider the Mona Lisa. Should it still be hanging in a bathroom somewhere? That's what Napoleon had it. Napoleon had the Mona Lisa in his bathroom. I don't think we should put the Mona Lisa in a bathroom, right? We need to preserve those things. It actually makes me think of this painting called The Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. And it's a famous painting that was stolen by the Nazis and then was given to someone, and that was given to a museum. And then they found it, and it was like, it sold for the most money ever. It's like 135 million. But instead of selling it, they gave it back to the original family it had come from. And the question was, who does this belong to? Is this cultural item something that should be there for all German people because it's such a beautiful painting? Or does it just belong in the house of someone who originally had it? And you can see, Wangeroo might say it belongs in a museum, but the Mama and Maggie would say, give it back to the family. And they're both right. The ending of that story is that the family gives it to a museum. They choose to give it, and they make the money off of it. The ending of the story, we have Wangeroo leaving in a huff, and we have Mama and Maggie just chew and dip outside. And the question, living in their culture, the question seems to point to the fact that not just the artifacts, like quilts, but the rituals and those who produce them are all parts of the culture, and you cannot divorce them or hang them on a wall without killing one of them. Right? You can't put a quilt on a wall without killing the quilt making. And you can't hold on to the quilt and use it without killing the quilt eventually. More importantly, can we reappropriate these things? Can the Johnson last name, while being a slave name, become their name because they're using it? Christianity may have been forced upon slaves, but they can still believe in Jesus and make it their own, as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did. Or they can choose the way that Malcolm X went and reject those things. It seems that the questions of education in this are also very potent here. Does education enlighten us and help us appreciate things, or does it separate us from things? If it wakes us up to the cultural value, great. But does that mean that it robs us of cultural participation? I think Walker seems to be making an argument for both here. But through Mama, it feels like there's an argument against Wangeroo. But it's an important question to ask because I think in the end, everyday use is a question of you can't continue a culture while you freeze it. And if we don't carry forward our rituals and our traditions, we lose them. And those are as important as the things they produce. I hope you enjoyed that.